Hey folks, Dave Specter with another episode of Blues and Beyond, and today we're continuing on with our series on producers, recording engineers, mixers, and we're here with Jim Tullio, just outside of Chicago at his Butcher Boy Studios in Evanston, Illinois. How you doing, Jim?
Good.
Good to see you, man. Tell us about the new studio, because I know it is relatively new.
Well, yeah, I've been here about 2.5 years now.
Mm-hmm.
It took me about 3 years to build it. I bought a 150-year-old building that was in really bad shape,
Yeah.
and converted it into a living space upstairs and a recording studio on the main floor.
Right.
This used to be a butcher shop, so hence the name Butcher Boy.
Got it.
You know.
And we're sitting in front of your Neve board.
That's it. 8058, 1972 Neve. Probably any 80 series Neve is probably the best sounding board ever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that particular series of Neve.
And you've worked with this board for a long time?
This particularly, no, I've only had this for 2 years. I've worked on many 80 series Neves.
Okay.
And actually, the 8078 over the years has been my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a chance to get this, and essentially they're all essentially the same. The only difference between the 78, it's got a 4-band EQ, and the
Okay.
58 and 68 have 3-band.
Got it.
So you have a little more, you have more parameters with the 78. But
For studio novices, what is it about Neve boards that is so special?
the sound, I mean, the sound is so fat
Yeah.
that anything you do through a Neve, you can tell it's a Neve.
Mm-hmm.
It's that it makes such a difference from any other console.
I see.
The only other console, in my opinion, that even comes close to this is like a Trident A range.
Mm-hmm.
They're very similar on the bottom end.
Okay.
And I think what really makes Neve special is obviously his design, but many people don't know this. After World War II, he bought all the government factories
Mm-hmm.
and kept the government workers and used those factories and workers to build his consoles.
Oh.
As a result of doing that, he was able to get all the government issued wire because he had bought those factories.
I see.
And it's very hard to get that grade of wire, and that's why they sound so good.
Interesting.
Plus his design, I mean, of
Uh-huh.
course.
And do you record mostly digital these days?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know you came up in the analog world.
Yeah.
Do you still have have clients or the desire sometimes to record analog?
Yeah, I have a 2-inch machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a 1/2-inch 2-track. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I hate to say it, but it's a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, most of my career I recorded with tape.
Sure.
And, it does sound better.
Yeah.
There's no question.
Really.
But, saying that, if you have the right gear like this and all the great tube outboard gear and
Yeah.
great microphones,
Right.
at the end of the day, I think it still sounds pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Cool. So you've had quite a career in music. Starting out in your younger days, you were signed as a recording artist with
Elektra.
Elektra Records. Tell us about that.
not a whole lot to tell. It was a band that I had put together when I was a teenager. And
Out on the East Coast?
yeah.
You're from Jersey?
Yeah. Well, originally from Brooklyn and then New Jersey.
Okay.
Mostly in New Jersey, the Atlantic City area.
Got it.
And yeah, we got a little deal with Elektra, and nothing really happened with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had already been playing upright bass. I was playing guitar in that band,
Mm-hmm.
but I had already been an upright bass player before that.
Mm-hmm.
My father sort of got me into that. My father was a jazz drummer, so he got me into bass. So when that band didn't really happen,
Yeah.
I just went back to playing bass,
Got it.
and I got to play with. I was hanging around the Village in New York.
Mhm.
I played with David Bromberg and
Mhm.
Fred Neil. Do you know who Fred Neil
No.
was? Fred was an interesting guy. He wrote that song "Everybody's Talking" that Nilsson had
Oh,
a
yeah.
big hit with.
That was in
Midnight
Midnight Cowboy.
Cowboy, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's a great song.
Fred was great. I worked with a little bit with John Sebastian. I worked a few times with Leonard Cohen.
Mm-hmm.
I was an upright bass player. Everybody wanted
Sure.
to.
So this was, what, early, mid-'60s?
No, this was probably early 70s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 70, 71, around
Yeah, you don't look that old.
there. And then I met Steve Goodman during that time,
Uh-huh.
because Steve used to go to New York City
Mm-hmm.
to get his chemo and blood transfusion treatments at Sloan Kettering. He had leukemia,
Mm-hmm.
and he wanted to go to the best.
Yeah.
And at the time, I think Northwestern was probably here, but I don't
Yeah.
think they were considered as good as Sloan.
Right.
So he decided to go to New York, and he would just find places in New York to sit in, and usually I was there,
Yeah.
playing with somebody.
Uh-huh.
So we got to know each other, and he used to always say, "Hey, Tools, play some tunes with me," because
Yeah.
I play bass. So we
Mhm.
started, every time he would come, he'd find out where, usually the guys that I was playing with at the time, and I'd play with
Mhm.
them. And then I got this opportunity to move here. Unrelated to Goodman or any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got that opportunity, I decided to do it. The only person I knew in Chicago was Steve.
Mm-hmm.
So I called Steve and I said, "I think I'm going to move to Chicago."
Yeah.
So he helped me get a place. And not really realizing, I didn't know how sort of big he was here.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't that big in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. But he was pretty big in Chicago.
Right.
So he was sort of the right guy to know. So that helped me transition into
So those were the days when the Earl of Old Town, the Old Town music scene,
Kind of at
was,
its peak.
was big.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
was around 74.
Okay. And you started hanging out at those clubs, I imagine,
Oh, yeah.
and living at them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing now because you go down to Wells Street and you go to Old Town. There's
There's
nothing.
nothing.
There's Second City.
Lincoln Avenue.
Yeah,
It's all like,
I know.
you
but there was a time where that was the
know. I mean, you
hotspot.
couldn't go, it was almost like, maybe not quite as dense as 6th Street in Austin.
Mhm.
You know, that area
Mhm.
where every other building's a club,
Yeah.
But it was kind of like that. The whole Lincoln Avenue Wells thing,
Yep.
it was very close to that. There was just club after club. And the thing that I noticed the most back then, being from New York and New Jersey area, that each club sort of advertised the next. You go into any club and they all have posters who's playing everywhere.
Yeah.
When did you see that? It's
Yeah.
like, so it just seemed like more of a community thing at that time.
Mhm.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah, and it wasn't just folk, was it?
No, I mean, in those sort of places that I was playing, it was.
Okay.
But I was interested in blues, and I was interested in a lot of stuff.
Right.
But I played upright bass, so I pretty much
Mhm.
stayed with sort of the folky sort of guys.
Okay, never got into the jazz scene
A
much?
little bit, but
A
no,
little
not
bit, yeah.
very much. A
'Cause
little bit.
I know the Plug Nickel was on Wells Street, I think maybe
Right.
back in the 60s.
Yeah.
But,
No, I never really got into the jazz scene. I mean,
Okay.
I did through my father. I played with my father when I was like 15. I used
Mhm.
to play weddings,
yeah.
and stuff, just to get my chops,
Uh-huh. So how did you become an engineer and a producer?
Sort of, well, the producer thing, I kind of always wanted to do it. I can tell you a quick story how that happened. I was a big Beatles fan,
Mm-hmm.
and my brother and I both. My brother was a drummer. I was a guitar bass player.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, we were right at the right age. We were like at the right age to be Beatles fans when they first happened. So every record that they did, we would go to the record store like at 4 or 5 in the morning and
Yeah.
wait for it to open. We'd be the first guys to buy a Beatles album. We'd go home and we'd learn every tune. Within 3 or 4 days, we knew every. And we were like we would learn them note for note.
Mhm.
And we had bands.
Mm-hmm.
And we were always did the latest Beatles album, until Revolver. And then when Revolver came out, we couldn't play it
Yeah.
as a 4-piece band.
Yeah.
So that's what actually got me interested in music production. I was like, how did they do that? How
Mhm.
did they get this sound? How did they, because, young people today, not to sound old or anything, but don't realize that when that record came out, the world had never heard anything like that before. Tomorrow Never Knows has a tape
Yeah.
up in it. Nobody heard that before. It was a first.
Mhm.
A lot of things on that record were firsts.
Yeah.
So that's what got me interested in music production.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first inkling. I said, I really got to find out how they do that.
That's great. Yeah.
And then I got my father. Actually, before that, my father bought us a Sound on Sound Roberts tape deck.
Mm-hmm.
This is in 1961. So it was the first time my brother and I ever heard of the idea that you could record on one track and overdub on the other. So
Yeah.
that was an incredible thing. you know, he could play drums, then I could play guitar. I could put a piano part down, then I could sing.
Yeah.
You know? So that was at a young age. I was 9 years old in 1961.
Wow. Okay.
So we had that.
Uh-huh.
So I had already had a little bit of that bug in me,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just because my father had bought us that tape machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then time went on, and I just, you know, then I bought. I ended up buying a 4-track when they became available, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and just was recording in my bedroom, you know,
Mhm.
creating things and whatever
Yeah.
I could. And then I sort of got out of that phase and started concentrating on being a performer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we got this band I had got signed, and then that didn't happen. So I figured, screw that. And like I said, I became a sort of an upright player, backing up other artists, and I
Mhm.
really didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was writing a lot at the time.
Mhm.
I started writing very young, so I wanted to write and produce.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I set my goals on. And the reason why I came to Chicago is I got a job writing music, being paid to write music. And I just took it.
What kind of music were you writing?
Well, it was an interesting thing. Believe it or not, it was with Playboy magazine.
Really?
A lot of people don't know this, but Hefner had put millions of dollars into laser technology. The Philips Corporation, I think it was, invented the laser beam,
Uh-huh.
or the whole laser audio thing, audio video thing. So Playboy had invested a lot of money into that. So they, after that happened, they came out with this thing called a laser disc.
I remember.
And Playboy wanted to make video magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Now this was in 1974, so nobody had these things, but he wanted to be ahead of the curve. So they hired me to score the music to these sort of video Playboy magazines. I was 22 years old or something.
Right.
You know? And I thought, you're going to pay me to write music? I'm coming to Chicago. Like I said, the only person I knew was Goodman. I didn't know anybody in Chicago.
Right. Now, you had studied composition with Aaron Copland?
Uh-huh.
Wow. Yeah. Where was this? I mean, that's pretty
I got really lucky.
Yeah.
I got really lucky. I met him through a guy that was in my band at the time. He was a cello player.
Mm-hmm.
And I was living in a town called Katona, New York, about 20 miles above Manhattan in Westchester County.
Mm-hmm.
And we were doing some recording in the city, and he had to leave the session that day. He said, I'm going up to do a chamber concert with Aaron Copland. I said, what? I said, well, I'm coming with you. You know? It happened to be a couple towns from where I was living. It was in a little town called Salem, New York.
Uh-huh.
So I went to this little chamber concert, and I met Aaron Copland. You know.
How old was he then?
This would have been 71 or 70, 71. So let's see, he died, I'm trying to calculate this. He died in 92, and he was 91.
Okay.
So he was probably 71
Uh-huh.
or 72.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just some, you know, I thought I was hotter than shit, and I didn't know anything,
Yeah.
but I thought I did.
Yeah.
You know? So he took me on, which I couldn't believe, and basically he just destroyed everything I wrote. I mean, it was very humiliating,
Mm-hmm.
but I needed that. It was humbling.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was humiliating and humbling, but I needed to be humble at that time.
Yeah.
And, you know, every young kid who has any bit of success thinks, oh, I know everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't know anything. You know? So what I learned from Aaron Copland was what not to do,
Mm-hmm.
more than what to do. I mean, he didn't say, here's what you do,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because if he did, he's basically saying, well, write like I do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Aaron Copland was the sort of composer that broke every rule.
Yeah.
He wasn't into the rules.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was into knowing them, but he
Yeah.
never used them.
So was he like looking at your pop songs?
Yeah, well, I wrote orchestral music too.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, yeah. And it was all. I mean, he was just made fun of it basically. So it was very humbling.
Yeah.
And for the right reasons, he destroyed it because
Yeah.
it needed to be destroyed.
Sure.
And I learned a lot from that
Yeah.
experience. You know. The most amazing thing he taught me was, he said the problem with modern music. He said modern composers, including songwriters,
Mm-hmm.
they write harmony first, meaning chord changes.
Mm-hmm.
You sit down and you play chord changes on the piano or guitar, then you put a melody on top.
Mm-hmm.
And he said what that does, he says you're building a wall, and your melody can only go so many places.
Yeah.
He said write melodies.
Mm-hmm.
then harmonize your melodies.
Yeah.
And I learned that.
Wow.
I'm not saying I always do that.
Sure.
But most of the time I do.
Yeah. Cool.